This is, I have to say, one of the most exciting, hilarious, fun seminars we've ever had at Brookings. And my dear, dear friend and colleague, Li Cheng, has set such a high standard. We were originally trying to do an East Asia panel, and I think it's my turn next on Korea. So I hope I can live up to the standard that you have set, and I hope I can find participants who are not only smart, but so passionate and funny. So I'm really pleased to be here. My name is Kathy Moon. I am here at Brookings, a senior scholar, and my area of focus is the Koreas, but I studied Chinese politics together with Dr. Li Cheng at Princeton. My two former students are now professors, Rachel Stern and Kristen Looney. So I would like to say, not the Wellesley, and I'm also a professor at Wellesley, I would like to say the Wellesley pioneering Amazons rather than the Wellesley Mafia. But I am very pleased that we have this gathering, and I think this marks a new chapter in Brookings history to bring 21st and 22nd century issues to our Falk Auditorium. Okay, we are now going to start the panel on protecting the legal rights of women and LGBTQ populations. Again, these are really cutting-edge topics, not only in China, but the rest of East Asia, actually. I know that Korea is actively pursuing discussion and debate about the rights of LGBTQ populations. Also in Japan, and in Southeast Asia, and of course in the United States. I mean, these are everyday issues that are in the newspapers. Gay marriage is right now under attack in several states, and of course LGBTQ issues in general are even more complicated and complex for people to understand. So I hope our panel will shed some light. I won't go into extensive introductions since you have the profiles with you, but we have Professor Guo Xiaofei from China University of Political Science and Law. Then we will have Jamie Horsley of the China Law Center at Yale Law School, and followed by my first intellectual offspring, Rachel Stern, who is an assistant professor at Berkeley at the law school there. And then we will have a discussion and open up to you. Thank you. Oh, yes. I'm going to be timing 12 minutes, and my former students know I am exacting. So I will, send up a flag that you have 2 minutes left, okay? So if, Professor Guo.
Hello, everyone. It's my great honor to be here. Today, I'm talking about the transsexual right to marry, by which I mean the right to marry someone of the different sex after sex reassignment surgery. To better understand it, first of all, I would like to introduce a lawsuit, W versus Register of Marriages. W was assigned a man at birth, and later he was diagnosed gender identity disorder. In 2008, he successfully became she, and accordingly, the sex on the identity card became female. However, in November 2008, she was refused at the marriage registration office when she applied for marriage with her male partner. The register told her that the sex at birth was the only standard to deal with marriage matters. W brought the case to the court, holding that the office had violated her marriage rights and privacy. Both the trial court and the appeal court upheld the office decision. in 2013, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal granted transsexuals the right to marry in their acquired sex with the person of different sex. And the meaning of female should include male to female transsexuals who have undergone sex reassignment surgery and had confirmed by the health department consent. Now, in mainland China, transsexuals do have the right to change their sex on the identity card. And afterwards, they do have the right to marry someone of the different sex after operation. The question is, has the realization of such rights encountered any setbacks like it was in Hong Kong? From the perspective of comparative law, we find transsexuals' right to marry in mainland China was achieved through a silent change, without any landmark cases in judiciary, without any debate and hearings in legislature, and without any legal advocacy from transsexual communities. The silent process was probably happening like this. First, some local government recognized sex change in civil register. And then there came the news that transsexual people registered marriage. We cannot find any transition between sex change in household registration and transsexuals' right to marry. It seems that transsexual right to marry is the only natural product of sex change in household registration. More likely, it's not about marriage system's acceptance of new type of human being, transsexuals. Professor Yang Dawen pointed that Yang Dawen was a leading expert in the field of marriage law. He pointed that if a person's biological sex is consistent with his or her certification of household registration, then the marriage registration is legal, as long as transsexuals have completed the sex reassignment surgery, and as long as they have changed their sex on the household register through legal procedures. In other words, as long as their bodies and the papers are consistent, their marriages are lawful. Law lives in the present. If the subjects of the marriage are a man and a woman, definitely they can get married. In mainland China, there was no debate on whether marriage should be based on sex at birth, nor was there any discussion on what marriage should be related to reproduction. All of these two questions have been haunting court cases in Hong Kong. Two arguments of the court is worth mentioning here in the case of W versus Register of Marriages. Firstly, if transsexuals are allowed to use their sex by choice in marriage, then this may open a door for same-sex marriage in Hong Kong. Secondly, the essence of marriage is procreation, which is particularly important in Hong Kong, a typical Chinese society. Thus, it's not easy to recognize transsexual right to marry. But in China, transsexual marriage is easy. It's more easy than in Hong Kong. Even if eventually Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal granted transsexuals the right to marry, but the court carefully avoided the equal protection clause. One reason might be if equal protection clause were to apply, the more space may be given to the same-sex marriage legal advocacy. Yet the court has not been ready for that. From this case, we may conclude in Hong Kong, the fear for same-sex marriage has been underlying the debates over transsexuals' right to marry. While generally in mainland China, governments and courts do not see this link. To illustrate this point, I would like to introduce another case in mainland China. In Shandong province, Gao Tingting, a male at birth, has been expecting to have sex reassignment surgery since the age of 20. and he still married a female and had a couple of 2 daughters. At the age of 30, he sued a hospital, Nanjing Dongfang Hospital. In 2005, Dongfang Hospital proposed to carry out sex reassignment surgery on her for free. They signed an agreement. Gao Tingting was responsible to provide legal documents. After Gao Tingting had provided some legal documents, Dongfang Hospital refused accepting her on the ground that the legal documents were incomplete. Gao Tingting sued Dongfang Hospital to Nanjing Qinhuai District Hospital, Nanjing Qinhuai District Court, requesting the court to order the hospital to fulfill the contractual obligations and perform the operation as soon as possible. The court held that under the professional regulations, one must divorce first before undergoing sex reassignment surgery. Since Gao cannot provide any proof of divorce, so the hospital could suspend the operation. Accordingly, the court dismissed Gao's claims in the first instance. Gao appealed to Nanjing Intermediate Court. The court took the view that the agreement signed by Gao and Dongfang Hospital did not require Gao to provide divorce papers to provide divorce certificates. So the hospital had no legal basis to suspend the operation. Finally, the hospital was ordered to pay Gao 50,000 yuan compensation. The current laws in China do not prohibit sex reassignment surgery during an existing marriage. However, this necessarily ends up with a marriage between 2 people of the same sex. In Gao Tingting's case, the Nanjing Intermediate Court was aware of this dilemma, but it didn't think that one must divorce before undergoing sex reassignment surgery. It reasoned. This is Gao Tingting. The Intermediate Court reasoned. A lawful marriage should only consist of 2 people of different sexes, and the same-sex marriage that is resulted from the sex change of one partner is not protected by the marriage law. However, this should not become the reason for prohibiting the sex reassignment surgery of a married person. The object of law is behavior rather than the result of certain behavior. Therefore, absent any prohibitory rules, we cannot deny the legality of behavior only because of its possible illegal consequences. In Gao's case, having sex reassignment surgery is a lawful disposal of her own body rather than a spousal right. Hence, the court would not deny a person's right to body disposition solely because it may affect his or her spouse's status. The silent acceptance of transsexual marriage rights, transsexual marriage in mainland China, and the judgment of Gao Tingting's case have shown that the fear for same-sex marriage has not yet been prevalent. We may explain the lack of political sensitivity from the following respects. First, transsexual right to marriage was only recognized within the framework of different sex marriage, which is Main Street to some degree. Secondly, the social movements campaigning for same-sex marriage in mainland China have not yet been strong enough to force the government to defend the purity of traditional marriages. Third, in fact, in mainland China, religious forces are also suppressed, and they have not had the chance to actively defend traditional marriage. A few years ago, a Chinese actress, Li Liping, who is a Christian, made anti-gay remarks on internet. Our CCTV, Central Television, Communist Party's voice, CCTV said homosexuality is a way of life and is worth respect. So therefore, in China, in mainland China, Communist Party, fundamentalism, and LGBT rights have complicated triangular relationship. There is no religious freedom. There is no Religious Freedom Restoration Act in China. There is no religious freedom. There is no religious freedom Restoration Act. I also told those two cases, Gao Tingting's case and W's case, to one of my friends, a leader of LGBT grassroots organization. He said, Hong Kong's laws took everything too seriously, unlike those in mainland China, which is rough, inconsistent, and free from cumbersome frameworks. But in my opinion, the transsexual marriage rights issues have exposed some drawbacks of modern governmentality. It's true that such rigorous systems, rule of law, and formal procedure can ensure stability and predictability of our social life. But sometimes it can make us live in the modern iron cage described by Max Weber. Therefore, the comparison I just made is not so much about differences between Hong Kong and mainland China, as the differences between modernity and pre-modernity. Mainland China is not a rule of society, but this society may leave some room for the subtle and the abstract. There is no time, that's all. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
So, good morning, everybody. It's a real honor to be here this morning. Studying women's rights and LGBTQ rights is not a focus of my work, which has been dealing with governments and dealing with good governance issues. But as a woman who has lived through the feminist movement in the United States and has spent a lot of time in China, and anyone who follows Chinese law tries to follow all the issues, I've found this to be a very important and fascinating issue. And I'm grateful and I congratulate the panel this morning and my co-panelists for contributing such exciting and important information. And while it might sound like it's a discouraging situation, I in fact feel very energized because this sort of illustrates one of my themes, which is while we've been so focused on the amazing economic transformation in China, we haven't talked so much about the social transformation. Despite restrictions on civil society, despite the suspicion of the foreign funding, which has really come to the fore in recent days, despite the difficulty of pressing these rights, you can see what a vibrant civil society exists in China. I'm also struck by something Professor Lee said this morning. She didn't think Asian women were really all that different from Western women. And hearing this discussion, it's very clear that what China is going through, the issues being addressed, the balancing that is going on in terms, and the change in social norms really resonates with the US experience. And indeed, it's part of a global experience as well, too. So we're shifting now from a discussion of social norms to the discussion of how law can help protect, how law recognizes and tries to help protect some of these rights. But of course, the two interact. You need good laws to establish the basic framework, the foundation on which behavior and rights will be enforced. But without the support of the norms, recognition within society of the importance of these rights, it is very difficult to enforce. So the two sort of go together, I would think. What is the law on the protection of women's rights? You've all heard this morning that the Constitution protects equal rights for women. And there's a very foundational law in China called the Law on the Protection of Rights and Interests of Women, which was first passed in 1992 and revised about 10 years ago in 2005, which actually enunciates a very impressive laundry list of rights for women. And it establishes, reiterates the foundational principle of equality of the sexes and uses the word the non-discrimination. Moreover, this law encourages women to protect their own rights, which is very, very important because the government seems to be suspicious of what in the US we call private remedies or individuals and groups trying to help enforce the law. It also charges the Women's Federation, which we've heard about this morning, Fulian, to help protect women's rights. And in some cases, we heard about their involvement in promoting the leftover women concept. But I found in the area of women's rights, a lot of the local women's federations are really, really working hard to address domestic violence and sexual harassment and employment discrimination, et cetera. So in fact, they can be a very positive force as well. The law establishes labor equality and the right to equal pay. We know in the United States how hard that is to implement. President Obama recently, of course, made the big push about changing the situation where even in the United States, women get about 70% of the wage that a man doing the same work would. The law also provides for equal property rights for women, which is a very complicated issue in the Chinese context, and specifically protects against sexual harassment, which is what our Women's Day 5 were protesting, and domestic violence. But again, this laundry list of laws is very hard to implement. These ideas need to be defined in practice. In the US and other countries, we've established some government institutions, for example, equal employment opportunity commissions that would help give avenues to enforce rights. And traditionally, the Chinese courts have been fairly weak and reluctant to take on sensitive and difficult new issues. Nonetheless, we're seeing some progress go forward, and I want to talk about some of the positive things this morning. First, on employment discrimination. China also passed an employment protection law, which establishes the right of equal employment and no discrimination based on gender, religion, ethnicity, et cetera. It doesn't specifically mention sexual orientation, however. Still, this law has a big gap. For example, it does not apply to the hiring process. It only applies to employment once you've already got your labor contract. So you have this huge vacuum. This Women's Federation did a survey, and over 70% of female college graduates say they've experienced discrimination in the hiring process. Still, we've recently had two firsts. Well, one real first case of a woman successfully bringing an employment discrimination case. The first one was in Beijing just a couple years ago, where the young woman was applying for a job at a private tutoring company and was just told to her face, "We want a man." Well, she went to court and she won and was awarded 30,000 renminbi, which is about $5,000. And just end of last year in Hangzhou, a woman was applying to a cooking school, and she was told the same thing blatantly, "We want men." She went to court and won too, but she only got 2,000 renminbi in compensation for that. Nonetheless, these cases are seen as very important because they kind of open the floodgates, especially since you may have read we're now moving toward in China a new kind of judicial transparency. For the first time in Chinese history, Chinese court decisions are being put online. And this is an amazing resource. There's over 6 million cases already now on the Supreme People's Court website. And I haven't had a chance to go search, but it's searchable. So people can go in and see who's won what cases, what were the arguments they used, what were the facts that helped. And that will help promote the advocacy. Now, for the LGBT community, there has been some progress. As you may all probably know, in 1997, homosexuality was decriminalized. In 2001, it was removed from the list of mental illnesses. But there's still, to date, no national law or regulation that addresses the issue of discrimination based on sexual orientation or offers protection for LGBTQ rights. I've learned that word now, too. The only regulation we've actually been able to find is a very local one in Changsha, Hunan. It's a regulation on credit reporting, and it prohibits collecting personal private information and describes private information to include information about one's sexual orientation. So this is Changsha, Hunan. Very interesting. Don't know the background of that particular provision. Nonetheless, this January, just a couple months ago, there was another first, a very important case where a young man in Shenzhen claims that he was illegally terminated on the basis of his sexual orientation, after he and his colleagues were sort of outed on social media and then admitted that they were homosexual. He was fired allegedly on other grounds, but he took this case to court. And the really important thing is that the case was accepted by the court and it was heard on January 22nd. Now, I haven't read the result yet to see if that opinion was announced. Maybe somebody in the audience has more update information. But this may well establish a kind of a precedent or an opening. So at least you can get into court, make your argument. The court has to issue a decision and explain its decision. So we're all waiting to see how that happens. Now, moving from employment discrimination to another very important issue that in fact was addressed 20 years ago at that Beijing Women's Conference, and that's domestic violence. You know, the recognition of domestic violence as a crime in the US and other countries also has gone through a very rough period. It's the question of when should the state intervene in family matters, you know, in the privacy of the home. And it's been a long road to try and get cases of, you know, marital rape and domestic violence to be treated as for what they are, which is a crime. So there's been a lot of lobbying on the domestic violence issue and long time work by the Women's Federation and others on drafting a law. The law is on the National People's Congress legislative agenda now, and it has been fast-tracked for action this year. An initial draft was published for public comment, and it has a lot of good things in it, but it maintains the traditional view that this is primarily a civil matter. And it provides, for example, protection orders, but they're civil protection orders, which means you have to go to court to get them enforced. Very interestingly, just last month, the Supreme People's Court, the Supreme People's Procuracy, the Ministry of Public Security, and the Ministry of Justice all issued a joint set of provisions on domestic violence that treat domestic violence as a crime. And the focus is the protection on the victim, on the safety of the victim of domestic violence, not on family harmony. Oh, and I only have 2 minutes to go. So anyway, this also has a lot of good things in it as well. It also it seems to expand the definition of domestic violence to others, to cohabitants, because apparently this is a big issue between young people living together or college students living together. There's a lot of domestic violence. So anyway, and there's a lot of lobbying going on by the women's groups, but also by a lot of NGOs and others on this issue to get a good law in place. On property rights, little noticed, but Barry Naughton, who's Brookings, I believe, pointed out, has been some movement on the whole issue of rural property rights. We've heard a lot about urban Chinese women, but rural Chinese women have it even worse in many, many ways. And one of the big issues for them has been their right to property in the countryside, which is very complicated, which I won't get into. But one good thing is that, again, in a party state document called the document number 1 that comes out every year on rural issues, included in it a need to change the legislation to address this new concept of property rights and make them stable, but also specifically a sentence, and to protect the property rights, the contractual property rights for women. So we're very interested in seeing that. Finally, on gay rights, I want to just mention one very interesting case, again, recently using the new Freedom of Information Act in China, which a lot of nonprofits have discovered is a very, very useful tool to get information from the government that you can then use to advocate and to bring lawsuits. This young man applied to register a gay rights NGO in Changsha, Hunan, the Changsha Comrades Center. He was denied, and he was told verbally it's because there is no legal basis, and gay rights organizations are not allowed. So he was unhappy. He filed an information request asking for the document that showed why there's no legal basis for registering a gay rights NGO. And he got a response from the government in writing that articulated 2 grounds. Number 1, that the marriage law only recognizes marriage between a man and a woman, and therefore gay marriage is illegal. And number 2, the regulations on registering social organizations say you can't register if your activities are illegal or contravene socialist morality. And they held that homosexuality is against traditional Chinese culture. Well, he went to court and filed a defamation suit. And after amending it several times, the court actually accepted the case, and they heard the case in March 2014. Now, the court rejected the suit, but it was the first time that a court has specifically addressed the issue of gay rights and homosexuality in China. And the grounds on which they rejected the lawsuit had to do with the fact that the document this young man obtained through their Freedom of Information Act was just non-binding guidance. It didn't provide a legal basis for him to go challenge. And they found against him on that ground, but again, at least they raised and made much more public this whole question of, is it really against the law and socialist morality to have a gay rights social organization? So I have to stop there, but at the very end, I want to say again how excited I am to see and hear from the people here this morning and see what's going on. And despite all the restrictions we see and the bad news we keep getting and the treatment of the Women's Day 5, there is such dynamism, such development, and such enthusiasm that it makes me feel very happy. And thank you all.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Chung Lee, for inviting me. The piece of the puzzle that I want to add to this conversation is I want to spend my 12 or 15 minutes with you today talking explicitly about the possibility of bottom-up legal mobilization. So this is very much in keeping with what Jamie was just saying. What are the possibilities for individual women to bring lawsuits, to fight them, and to win, and to bring attention to these issues surrounding gender equality? And I have to say that in preparing for this today, this was very much on my mind. I live in the Bay Area, I teach at Berkeley, and all we've been talking about all of last week rather, is the Ellen Pao lawsuit. Ellen Pao, of course, being the woman who brought the lawsuit, the employment discrimination lawsuit against the venture capital firm Kleiner Perkins. She lost in court, and the conversation has been around, she may have lost in court, but maybe she won in the court of public opinion by drawing attention to these issues. So I mention Ellen Pao for two reasons. One, I think it's obvious, but it kind of needs to be said too. We're fighting our own battles here in the United States around misogyny and sexism and employment discrimination. So that's worth acknowledging. And then it gives me a chance to queue up the question about China and to say, where is China's Ellen Pao? Is she out there? Is it coming? And what kind of battles and challenges will she face in bringing her version of this lawsuit? If you take, I don't know, like 3 or 4 giant steps back from the situation, it seems like the conditions might be pretty good for China's Ellen Pao. Xi Jinping comes to power. One of the big focuses of his new administration is rule of law and building rule of law. The Chinese Communist Party has long been committed rhetorically to gender equality. Professor Wang mentioned this morning that that was part of the success of the Chinese Communist Party, especially in rural areas in the 1930s and 1940s as they were building support across China. The Employment Protection Law specifically mentions gender discrimination. So it seems like there might be grounds for a lawsuit in addition to this rhetorical focus on rule of law. And then to add a third element, what we've seen in the last 15 years in the 2000s is the emergence of a coterie of lawyers who are interested in taking on at least some pro bono cases and using the law to push along social and political change. So I'm talking about a wide range of people who go by a wide range of labels. These are the rights protection lawyers, the Weiquan lawyers, the human rights lawyers, and also the public interest lawyers, at least some of whom seem like they might have interest in picking up and taking on a gender discrimination case. But yeah, when I look at this landscape, and I don't know, it's like we're doing a good cop, bad cop thing here. Jamie brought the optimistic perspective and told us about all the good stuff that was going on. But when I look at the same landscape, I don't see a lot happening. And of course, there are exceptions. Guo Jianmei's legal aid organization in Beijing is certainly an important one. But it's notable that last year in 2014 was the first gender discrimination case in hiring. And this is really noteworthy because if you ever look at the advertisements for recent graduates in China, they're kind of amazing because they so often have age or gender requirements just in them as part of the ad. So clerical support wanted, woman preferred, under 30 better, pleasing attitude please. That kind of thing. You will see that kind of thing in job advertisements, which of course is totally discriminatory language. So it was a big deal. Cao Ju, which is the Beijing case last year, brought the first case about discrimination in hiring. This was because she was explicitly turned down because the company said they needed a man. And that case was groundbreaking and it was a big deal. I don't mean to take any of that away from it. But there hasn't been a lot of action. This is, cases are pioneering for a reason. That means there's not a lot happening there. So even though I teach in a law school, I'm trained as a political scientist. And political scientists in general tend to study things that do happen. We're interested in protests, we're interested in revolution, we're interested in things that happen and that change the world. So I want to flip the question a little bit and ask, how do we understand the politics of inaction in this particular legal and political space? And how, in the process of understanding that, do we map gender onto the landscape of issues of legal activism? So how is gender similar and different from other causes that people are interested in pushing along inside China, whether it's environment, whether it's freedom of speech, whether it's government accountability, whether it's corruption? These are all issues that are on the table. Transparency. There's a whole nexus of issues on the table that at least some lawyers are interested in picking up and bringing to the courts. So where does gender fit into this? To some extent, it faces the same issues and some of the same ambivalence as those other types of legal activism. I did a big project on environmental law and environmental litigation, and there you really see the tension between, on the one hand, the state treating these lawyers and thinking about them as troublemakers, and then sometimes switching gears and thinking about them as public-spirited volunteers who are helping out weak and disadvantaged groups. So in this sense, I think that gender and women's rights and LGBT rights are quite similar to environment, labor, and all of these social issues that we might say are a little bit politically sensitive, that they're kind of in the middle. They're right at the boundary of what it's possible to talk about and to push for in China. I think about them together and collectively as examples of boundary-pushing politics. But there's, I think, two things that are different about gender that change this landscape. And I never thought I would say this, because when I was doing the interviews for my book on environment, I thought that was the hardest issue area ever. And the environmental lawyers all said it is so hard to bring and fight and win these environmental cases. But I actually think that gender might even be a little bit more difficult and face a little bit more of an uphill battle. And I think that for two reasons. The first is the structure of the bar itself. About 20% of lawyers in China are women. And that is a number that has not been rising all that fast. It's a number that has been rising slowly, not nearly as fast as the general expansion of the legal profession. And in general, in any society, when the bar gets bigger, it tends to get more diverse, and you tend to get a wider array of interests and causes inside the bar. So the fact that the feminization of China's bar has been so slow, I think, is directly related to why we see so few cases involving gender equality and women's rights. Again, cross-culturally, cross-nationally, cross-time, across a lot of things, female lawyers are more likely to represent female clients disproportionately. So I think that these two are intimately linked, the feminization of the bar and the relative absence of women's rights cases in the legal system. And the other factor that I want to bring up, again putting on my hat as a political scientist, is I just have to talk about the state for a second, because we haven't really talked about it this morning. And there's this really deep ambivalence, I think, at the center of the Chinese state around gender issues. There's that great history of commitment to gender equality. There's all those Mao and socialist slogans about women holding up half the sky and pushing women into the workforce to work and to join in the process of socialism. But at the same time, this is a state where it has to be pointed out there are deeply discriminatory policies that have been implemented by the state and that are on the books. I'll just give one example in the interest of time, which is differential retirement ages for men and for women. So men who work for the government in China retire on 5 to 10 years after women do. So women are often facing a forced retirement age of 50 or 55. That's really young. It has implications, of course, for pensions, but also, especially as life expectancy rises, a lot of people are just hitting their stride at those ages when they might be pushed out of the workforce. So I'm using that as an example of, I think, the tension inside the Chinese state about how to deal with gender equality and whether or not it's an important issue. So when I look at the environmental lawyers, I think they really, in a sense, have the wind at their backs and have a sense that this is an issue of rising importance to the state and to the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't think that the lawyers who take on cases related to women and to gender equality have the same sense at all. So this attitude trickles down and it manifests itself in the court system. I just want to mention two particular places it does. The first is that courts will refuse cases that they don't want to deal with. That's absolutely routine, even though it's not supposed to happen on the books. So for example, the Employment Protection Law doesn't define discrimination. It says no discrimination, but it never gives any guidance about what it is or how you might know it when you see it. And the Supreme People's Court hasn't stepped in to issue an interpretation, which is what they might do. So in a situation of legal ambiguity, it's kind of understandable why the courts might step back and choose to pass on a case that seems both difficult and politically sensitive. And then the second point is that the burden of proof in these employment discrimination cases is on the plaintiff. This might seem like a minor or a technical point, the kind of point that someone who teaches in a law school would bring up, but it's actually totally critical because the burden of proof is a huge signal from the state. It's the state putting its thumb on the scales of justice and giving a sense of how the authorities want these cases to go. So by putting the burden of proof on the plaintiff, in this case, the woman who would be alleging discrimination, again, that means that the lawyers and the women who are bringing these cases, the Ellen Paos of China, really are facing an uphill fight, first to get in the door and then to win their case. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
If you would all join us. Professor Guo? We're going to now spend a little bit of time discussing some of these issues. I'll have a few questions for our panelists, and then we will open up to the floor. And we will end no later than 1:10, because I have to get on an airplane. All right, can you hear us? I'm going to just raise some points, and these comments and questions are not necessarily directed toward anyone in particular. But what I always like to do is point out some of the issues that go missing in a discussion. And then I have a larger question based on all of your expertise as experts in the law, okay, and China. So a few comments on what I haven't heard today at the conference, which is, number one, issues related to women, men, children, and the trafficking, human trafficking, especially for forced marriages in China and sexual labor, forced sexual labor. And I think this is a very pressing issue internationally, and we know that in China it is also a very significant phenomenon. So I think that's something maybe, hopefully, can take up at another conference, Dr. Chung, but something that if you care to address, wonderful. Two is a related missing element here, a population of Chinese women increasingly going as marriage migrants to foreign countries, whose abuses abroad are not being protected by the Chinese government or Chinese society, or by the host society necessarily. And this is another issue area that I think it's going to grow, and so we need to pay attention to. A third issue here is single mothers in China. As far as I know, there are no particular government support structures for single mothers, and this is related to sexuality and the freedom of one's sexual expression and acts. It's also related to the pressures of marriage. It's related to economic pressures and class issues. And it's related to the hukou system, because even though legally a child born in China of a single parent can be registered in the hukou system, often it's up to the local officials to permit it or not, and in many cases the children go missing. So they're unregistered, therefore they don't exist legally in a way, and they are not able to access other rights. I thank my research associate Paul Park for bringing this to my attention. The last comment here about what's missing is, I'm so glad that you had brought up the reality of rural women being very different from urban women, but also ethnic minority women and the autonomous zones, right? We know that such a significant portion of China's large population is not Han Chinese, and China has many Chinas, right? Or some anti-Chinas also. And so how do we look at women's rights, gender issues, sexuality issues, LGBT issues in the context of minority rights in China? My one question, and again, you can take it or leave it, and we can open it up, is no one has mentioned human rights in China. And yet what we are talking about today is human rights. On the international level, in international law and international transnational activism, all of the issues people have raised today are part and parcel of the larger category of human rights law and human rights activism. And yet, why have we not mentioned human rights? And how does your work on these different rights and the different legal aspects of the rights tie in with, or perhaps not able to be tied in with, a discourse on human rights in China? So I'll leave it at that. Would anybody like to address any aspect before we open up to the floor?
Okay, well, talking about the human trafficking issue, I was very interested when we started seeing the imbalance between the male and female after the one-child policy led to this preference for giving birth to boys, that it was almost a resurgence of the traditional crime of kidnapping women for marriage and to make them, take them into a household as a young daughter. So now we call it human trafficking, that's the modern term. but it's a very, very old crime that we've seen throughout Chinese history. I know China has joined some of the international conventions, and they are trying to work on it, but I do think that it's a big issue. My own personal suggestion to the Chinese government about their population imbalance and easing of the one-child policy would be they should consider more liberal immigration policies like we do in the United States. They have a big problem of way too many men and not enough women, ironically, because we're still struggling for those women to get the rights that they deserve under law. I think maybe you had something to say too. Did you want to address that issue or, yeah?
I was just going to jump in on the last point about women's rights and human rights. I think it was in 1995 when Hillary Clinton went to Beijing. She famously said women's rights are human rights and made that link explicit that we've been kind of dancing around all day. I think we got closest to it when we were talking about the 5 feminist activists who have been detained. I mean, that is so clearly a human rights issue. Not that the rest of it isn't, that all of it is a human rights issue, but that really brings that issue to the forefront, to look at the ways in which freedom of expression is really bound up with women's rights and in pushing forward this agenda. So I'll just take that as a reminder, I think, that sometimes I think those of us who study China can, I think, get caught up in the Chinese state's own vocabulary about these issues, which tends to focus on segmented forms of rights, hyphenated rights, women's rights, environmental rights, as opposed to the umbrella term of human rights. And it's good to be reminded that that's actually what we're talking about, that it's all under that umbrella.
我可能会需要一下翻译，不好意思。我补充一下刚才谈到的那个人口贩卖的问题。我觉得今天在世界上提起人口贩卖，好像大多数都会想到 sex labor。但是在中国的所谓的人口贩卖，基本上我觉得跟 sex labor 关系不是很大。我在人大的一个老师潘思明教授是长期关注中国的性工作者权利，希望是去罪化的这样一个研究。但是这样的他长期的研究就是会发现，中国在性工作领域这个人口贩卖非常少，几乎都不会引起特别大的关注。那今天在中国的人口贩卖，主要是在所谓的这个我是觉得很有意思的地方在于，实际上在农村的一些地方，那个要很高的彩礼，跟那个贩卖之间的就是婚姻，反而是人口贩卖一个很重要的一个领域。就是说，你已经分不清楚是一种彩礼式的这样一种对，就是要很高彩礼式的这种婚姻的买卖，还是说就是所谓的一般的那样一个现在国际上所讲的性奴隶的这样一个人口买卖，我觉得不是一个就是在中国是特殊的，我觉得在这方面跟国际上最起码那个舆论是不太一样的。
I'm sorry, I have to speak in Chinese. Let me add to the issue of human trafficking. I think globally, when people talk about human trafficking, usually they refer to sex labor. But in China, I think the situation is different. When it comes to human trafficking, the issue is not mostly about sex labor. I have a professor at Renmin University by the name of Professor Pan. He did some study on this issue, and he's also advocating of decriminalization of prostitution. According to the study, his long-time study, when it comes to human trafficking, the issue of sex slave is very it's not a big issue of this problem. And so the main thing is, I think it's also very interesting to notice that in rural China, sometimes the issue of human trafficking might be kind of confused or linked to the issue of marriage, in which too much dowry is demanded. So when you demand too much dowry, are you selling sex? So in here we can see a linkage or a blurry of line between human trafficking, between sex slave or marriage, which demands high dowry. But again, I think in China, the situation is kind of unique. It's different from the global issue of sex slave and human trafficking.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I'd just like to say, too, that I think one reason we didn't mention human rights is we sort of assume that this is a human right. In fact, I think all the work we do, all the work everybody's doing, but particularly in the legal field where we're working, we think helping to work on legal reform, legal improvements, legal protections for rights, all of that is precisely about human rights, but talking about it in a vocabulary that, you know, is not as confrontational as directly calling it human rights. But I think that's sort of an assumption of almost everything that we do.
I think those of us who've studied social movements, and as Rachel has also, I mean, the framing of an issue, how you do it locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, is critical. And sometimes the framing is different at all those levels. Just a rebuttal, or in terms of the trafficking issue, I was specifically, there is internal trafficking within China, a lot of it for forced labor in general, not just sex labor, but also there is the specific problem of trafficking of North Korean women into China as a quite significant phenomenon, who are forced into marriages and into the sex industry. And so I'm also talking about cross-border sex trafficking. And of course, there are Chinese women who go cross-border into the sex industry and also into forced labor outside of China. So let's just open up the floor and take some questions. If you would tell us who you are and just keep your questions brief. One question at a time, please. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Nancy Tang from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but I'm here in personal capacity as a young Chinese feminist. So I think this is a question for Rachel Stern, but for Professor Stern, but for all the panelists as well. Is that you have pointed out the embedded activism nature of, like, whether it's like environmental activism or feminism in China. And this is a question that has actually surfaced after the arrest of the 5 feminists recently, is how to understand the relationship between Chinese feminism and other forms of human rights activism, and especially like the more controversial, like for instance, democracy movement and other forms of dissidence movement. And I think the larger overwhelming question that I have is that in a society with no oversight or checks and balances on the state power, with no actual judicial independence or like no actual free media and no like I guess like a as a vibrant civil society as one may wish, how would it be possible to actually approach a certain status of gender equality or environmentalist movement under the current framework without challenging the state power? Thank you.
We'll take another question, please, if you have one, and then we'll come back to the speakers. Any others? Okay, Rachel.
There's so much embedded in that question about whether or not it's possible to push for social and political change without bumping up against state power, or at what point you bump up against state power, and whether or not it's possible to really these issues are about redistributing political power, and that's always a contentious process. I certainly think that the people who are involved in these movements see them as a critique inside the hegemony. And what I mean by that is actually something really simple. I just mean that they don't see themselves as opposition politics. I think there's a genuine sense of being loyalists and patriots and pushing inside the system for a better China, and a sense of optimism that that's possible, that there is possible that the system can go a good way towards reform under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that that's the perception of the people who are leading these movements. Although I think you're right to point out that, you know, kind of in the end, what you need is a redistribution of political and economic power, and that is always going to be contentious. If I put on my social movements hat for a moment, what has struck me as so interesting about the arrest of the 5 women was they were expanding into the type of activism they were doing, this kind of performance activism or street activism. I think what I'm afraid that what their arrest is going to broadcast to other groups is that tactic is off limits, that it was a question of tactics and of drawing a line to push that particular kind of outreach directly into the public sphere as something that's not acceptable. And it's particularly noteworthy because some of the activism surrounding HIV/AIDS had used very similar tactics. So it's a change. It's a shift. It's a tightening and a clamping down, which is part of what has made this so momentous on the one hand and so disturbing on the other.
I can say too. I thought when talking about the 5 women, when it first happened, I thought it was probably more not about the message, but about the means. And not so much the performance art per se, but the fact that it was organized to take place in several different cities at once. And if you remember back to the Xu Zhiyong case, that was one of the big concerns for him. It was not just the message, it was the fact that he was accused of having kind of masterminded this national movement. And it seemed to me that that was the frightening thing, the organizational aspect like Falun Gong that really appeared to be a challenge. But I wonder, given this amazing outpouring of anger and then support for the women, whether now it's shifting again and focusing more on the content in a way. And I just wanted to comment that in dealing with social change, there are a lot of mechanisms now that you didn't have before in China. You don't have to just protest. And the government is conscientiously trying to provide more mechanisms. And I think a lot of that's good. So for example, a lot of these groups, they do, inside the government and outside the government. They are working and cooperating with governments on draft laws and policies. They are participating formally when they put out laws and regulations now for comment. That's an established, routinized thing. But informally, there are a lot of meetings with them as well. And as Rachel said, I think they try to cooperate with the system. But then at the end of the day, often lawsuits now are a new form, really, of protest in a way, of trying to protect the rights. But it fits within the party's own rhetoric. They're trying to move protests off the streets into the courts. And what we see now is a movement with this emphasis on rule of law and judicial justice and trying, and it's very interesting, trying to make the courts more professional and at least somewhat more independent. And under the current president of the Supreme People's Court, we've really witnessed some amazing things in terms of the kinds of cases they're now taking. There have been 2 now sex discrimination cases by women, at least, and maybe more that we haven't even heard about. And some of the opinions that they're issuing and explanations that they're giving to people. So I think it's sort of an interactive thing. This kind of thing with the women, I think, always kind of stumps us because we don't know what was thinking or what was exactly the calculus. And in the current environment, it looks depressing, but if you sit back and try and analyze everything that's going on, I still think that there are positive things that we shouldn't forget and got to kind of figure out all the contradictions in terms of the rhetoric and then the action that's going on in China today.
Li Cheng has a question.
Excellent presentations, really all of you. We talk a lot about the bottom-up movement, but let's also look at the top-down, particularly the rise of legal professionals in decision-making circle over the past decade. And of course, there are a lot of fake degrees, but also the fake degree itself, in the field of law itself is meaningful. But most importantly, there are some of them really got solid law degrees. And some of them study at Yale, at Berkeley, and some of them, also study at the Yale University, Chinese University of Political Science and Law. Could you comment on this should be the reason for optimism? Could you even give some examples? Now, early this morning, we talked about the Western influence of conspiracy. But the whole thing is about the legal profession, legal education is really come from the West. It's not from the Chinese tradition, right? So, at the time that Xi Jinping emphasized rule of law, basically you embrace the idea that China should learn from the West in this particular field. So, I want to get your comments.
Is there another question we might take before we go back to yes, back there?
Hello, my name is Man Yu Dong. I'm a student to Professor Rachel Stern at UC Berkeley. I'm now working as an intern at the Wilson Center. So this question is primarily addressing to Professor Stern, but I I would like to hear other panelists' opinion on that as well. So a couple days ago, I think Professor Kenneth Libertho at the Brookings Institute gave a talk at the CSIS on the arrest of a feminist activist on the International Women's Day. His view is that this arrest of those feminist activists doesn't really mean that the leadership is going against feminist movement in general. It's simply the leadership doesn't want any agenda that gets ahead of its own planning from bottom up. They would rather to implement a top-down reform or improvement of gender rights, kind of going after Dr. Lee Cheng's point. And I remember that back in Berkeley, we had this class activity where a lot of our classmates rated gender issue as a less sensitive issue and on the all politically sensitive spectrum. So my question is, after this arrest of the feminist activists, do you think gender issues is still at the bottom of the sensitive spectrum, or is it rising? And do you agree with Professor Libertho's evaluation of this political significance of this event? Thank you.
I can pick up. So rather, I'll tell you, I will give you my interpretation of the event, but I also just kind of want to take a step back and point out the environment of uncertainty that surrounds any kind of crackdown in China, and the fact that the conversation then becomes a conversation about what line did these activists cross. And it's hard to know. We've got a whole bunch of different theories. I mean, Professor Lieberthal has a theory that the state wanted to take the lead on the issue. Jamie said maybe there was the organizational structure, that there was too much going on. I've heard other theories about timing, about all kinds of different things. So I just want to point out that this dynamic, this uncertainty, and then the guessing, and then the kind of rules that we take away, I think we have to be really careful with them, because they are just guesses. And it may not be as rational and thought out a plan as perhaps we give the Chinese authorities credit for. My own theory, to add to the pot, having just told you that we should stop engaging in this parlor game. But my theory is, as I was saying, I think it's about tactics and about the street protest in particular. And I think it's about the distinction between people who work inside the system, TJ-NA, and people who work outside the system, TJ-Y. And I think that the pressure is to push activists inside the system into private dialogues with government authorities, into policy making behind the scenes. And what was so scary about these women was that they were working outside the system, that they were TJ-Y, that they were out on the streets taking their case to social media, and for that reason basically uncontrollable. And we're not inside the system, and we're not responding to the warnings that people who are inside the system would probably have been responsive.
But yet people have been doing that before, and so why now? So you raised that issue too. But
yeah, I mean, my guess, this has been a kind of in the post-Tiananmen era, there's been kind of evolutions of what's possible and what's not possible. I was a little surprised that the kind of street demonstrations and performance art were allowed to go as far as they did.
Exactly, right.
So.
Yeah.
And the question about the legal profession?
Well, Xi Jinping has said we should still learn from the beneficial experience of foreign countries, even though they're very suspicious about the foreign funding. And we still continue to see cooperation, from government agencies sending people to research issues on which we have common problems and experience. They're still sending students overseas. I'm not sure whether the personal legal experience of some of the people getting into positions is going to be able to make a difference unless the system as a whole is supporting them. But one example is, of course, Zhou Chang, the current president of the Supreme People's Court, who actually did study law at Southwestern University and was very interested, when he was governor of Hunan province, wanted to, as part of his Chuangxin, his contribution, to promote development of administrative law, the law regulating relations between citizens and the government, and passed China's first Administrative Procedure Act and promoted transparency and public participation. And now up in the court has really, really been pushing this judicial transparency piece, which is very, very important. You know, we haven't really seen the open trials yet, but a consistent basis, but it's getting better. And as I mentioned, just the fact that courts are now having to make their decisions public, and they have to explain their decisions better than they've done before so that they can educate the people. Part of it is instrumental. They also want to be able to yindao, you know, lead and control public opinion. But this whole idea of the courts being more responsible and by having to make opinions public, just like in the government, the idea is it's less possible to have undue influence, you know, leading to political outcomes that can't be justified on a legal basis as well. So I think that it's positive, but that people used to wonder whether having Li Keqiang, who also has some law background too, might make him China's next Gorbachev, and I don't think anybody is thinking that now.
Okay, we are at the closing hour, and I am very grateful to our panelists, both for this round and for the earlier panel, to Li Chung, and especially to Ryan and Vincent. Are you here? Our staff, our fantastic staff, all of the senior scholars here at Brookings, we cannot survive without our staff. And actually, several of them are sitting right here. Would you all stand up, please, if you are in the room, so that you could get the credit for the work? Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Come on. Thank you very much. I hope this will be an ongoing conversation through the years, and it'd be nice to have you back at some point to see where we are a few years down the road. So thank you, and thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.